Hi class, welcome to Inca 3.1. We're going to look at the political and imperial structures of the Inca state, which governed out of Cusco and administered a very broad empire that covered thousands of miles in all directions, north and south, not thousands east and west. So the Inca unit, the government, the empire, was known as Tawantinsuyu, which means four parts together. And it was centered in Cusco, as you already know. And in the previous chapter, we looked at a number of Inca emperors who, especially since Pachacuri, began expanding the empire up to today's Ecuador and south to today's Chile. And they then, once the empire's territory consisted of much more than the Cusco homeland, they began to organize it, and we'll look at it as it's at its peak at about the early 1500s there on the right. On this slide, not only do we have the quick map for you to peek at, but on the left we have the administrator and then what unit they administered. So at the top of the hierarchy was the Sapa Inca and the Koya, which would be the queen. And of course, they oversaw the entire empire of Tawantinsuyu. And then each suyu was controlled by an apu, and then within each suyu there were a number of provinces, dozens, perhaps a little less, perhaps more, and this was overseen by a tokrikok, sometimes pronounced torikok in other books. And then below each province, each province in the Suyu was divided into two groups below that, and then within those two groups there were a number of ayus, and as you already know, it's probably the third PowerPoint to tell you, the ayus were the basic social unit of the Andean world, and they were led by curacas. So within this map on the right we have the four colors, and then we could further divide them into past the Suyus to the provinces, to the different moieties, and then to the Ayus themselves. But that would be a very complicated map. We don't need to do that for this class. Now, there were leaders or curacas over not just Ayus, but certain numbers such as 10, 5, 1, thousands, 500s, 100s. Kind of just depended on the area and how dense the population was. And under the Ayu Curaca or the Torikok, then each unit leader oversaw what the taxation would be. And of course, taxation was, for the most part, rotational labor, mita labor. And then the administrators of this coerced labor then used it to build a pretty sophisticated administrative infrastructure. Again, parts of this you've already seen in earlier units. The first would be the Inca Highway, and we're going to see on a slide right after this slide kind of how that was organized. There was two main north-south routes, one along the coast and one through the highlands, and then east-west in between the two north-south routes there were a variety of connectors that were usually smaller and not as heavily traveled. The Inca state would use its resources, money, people power to not only build these roads, but to adjust them as needed. If they were in swampy lands, they would build items needed to drain the swamp or to allow the water to drain off the road. If there was a very large chasm of a river gorge, they would build bridges over that, and the roads would be wide where needed, up to 4 meters wide, narrower when not needed to be wide, such as a meter wide. And so instead of a uniform road, the road kind of was adjusted to what the empire thought would be needed for commerce. And of course, commerce is commerce that keeps the empire going. It's not commerce the way we see it now. And so movement of the military, or what the Inca state wanted as commerce, was of utmost importance. And along the Inca roads, as we've seen before, they had a variety of storage depots called tampus, These would allow the administrative state to move people around, including very large armies, and have supplies at what they considered to be one day's march away. In addition to tampus, they had a storage depot called a kolka, and these were in fact more for the populations. Certainly, imperial populations would have precedence of getting the foods, but in times of bad harvests and the like, then the kolkas could provide food that had been preserved for the populations that the Incas wanted to keep alive. Um, Along the road system and using these storage units when necessary was the Chasqui runner system. They were able to carry small items if they needed to. Of course, there's lots of stories about how they might have carried a fish from the ocean to Cusco. We're not so sure that'd be a wise use of resources, but I suppose it could have happened. But definitely information, especially in times of war where the enemy was, where they were moving, if there was a rebellion in a province. Politically important information like that was messaged from one Chasqui to the next. Typically, academics believe that they ran about 1.4 kilometers, and that information could get through from one somewhat end of the empire to the center of the empire in a couple days. The Chasquis were providing their mita labor, and so if you were really fast, the empire might choose you to be a Chasqui. That was considered a pretty good mita to have. You were well taken care of. And then one more administrative element that's kind of important to see is that more rarely, not as often as tampus or kolkas, there would be a regional administrative center. That was a place where you could get a whole bunch of Ayu curacas to come together and meet with the empire for hundreds of miles around. And these administrative facilities then could allow the Inca Empire to get what it wanted done in certain areas. For those who will be taking colonial Latin America with me here at Gonzaga, Cajamarca is one of those regional centers, and it's in the very north west of the empire. It's west of Quito and south of Quito for that matter, and this is the area in which the Sapa Inca Atahualpa is captured and kidnapped and eventually murdered by the Spanish conquistadors under Pizarro and Almagro. So also in the next few slides, we're going to look at how the empire kind of organized itself to be politically as strong as it could be, and this involves terrace farming. Now this could have been put in the economic section, but we want you to remind you that it's the empire that lays out a lot of the land, money, if you're going to call it that, and especially labor, which they've captured with the mita, to maximize the output in these various areas. So this gives us an example of the terrace farming. This one happens to be at a very famous place that some of you have been or might go to at Machu Picchu. And so this farming was definitely used to supply this regional center here at Machu Picchu. Here's a cross-section of the Incan terrace farming system. And what you can tell from this slide and the last is they're able to take land that is not farmable, such as this steep hillside, and turn it into quite a bit of farmable flatland. So they organize the gravels, the sands, and the soils in ways that will allow it to be irrigated as water is pushed through these fields in an irrigated fashion. This allows the empire to maximize economic production in areas that otherwise would not have produced. Again, like the Aztecs, I'd like to remind you that this is being done in a part Paleolithic, part Neolithic age. It's part Paleolithic because they haven't really entered the Metal Age or Bronze Age of tool use, and so in that way it's still Paleolithic. It's Neolithic in that they have moved forward with an agricultural revolution, so a little bit of both. And then interestingly, in both areas, the wheel has not been either invented or utilized by either civilization, yet they're able to create these very large, complex um, administrative empires. Looking at the Inca roads from this chapter, you can see that there are two green roads going north and south, more or less, one in the highlands, one along the coast. And then in a typically in an east-west direction, you find feeder lines moving towards the coastal or towards the highland highway. North-south is the way they organize their empire along the spine of the highlands rather than an east-west. If you go, of course, too far to the west, it stops the land. And as you go too far to the east, you run into the Amazon or other areas that don't support dense populations. And these are areas that the Aztec and Andean peoples can't conquer or absorb into their system. On the right, you can see some tourists hiking along the Inca Road. This is something you can do in your lifetime. Again, you can see the road is not made for carts or wheeled traffic, so it does not have to be smooth for that reason. And you might even imagine Incan armies or chasquis running along this part to deliver the information that they were required to deliver. Come on now. There we go. And we have our final administrative units pictured here. Up at the top, we have the famous 1600s Guaman Poma de Ayala version of what the chasqui looked like. He has them blowing horns. The one on the right has a dog with him, interestingly enough. Kind of a little Hispanized version of what was going on. We don't have a lot of dog use in the Inca world. We do have dog use after the Spanish conquest, so that might be coming in from that. Up at the top right, we have one of those colcas, which was a storehouse that could keep the area alive with preserved foods. And down below to the right, we have another example of a tampu that would have the appropriate storage for either a military unit going through, a chasqui, perhaps a governor was passing through. And this was, again, the tampus were separated out in what the empire believed was 1 day's march. Now, turning to the military portion of the book, the wealth from the previous emperors tended to stay in the hands of the old emperor's family. This did not always happen. The book doesn't quite explain this. You could have a little bit of a purge, a political purging, and a delegitimizing of previous emperors in order to seize their assets. And this did happen from time to time. You don't need to worry for this class which emperors did that or didn't. But generally speaking, the new emperor needed to expand territory to create personal wealth for his family, his extended family. He would oversee with a variety of generals, usually 2 to 8, depending on how big the army was. An army that was typically closer to 40,000, but could grow to over 100,000 if the situation needed it. That was usually quite rare. The army was not like our army, with a boot camp and everyone forced and molded into one unit, but instead was kind of a honeycomb organization of many different ethnicities. Each ethnic Ayu would have the Hatan Runa, which is the heads of household. They, for their Mita service, would have to go fight for the Inca state. And so they did so, but under their own Ayu. So they would dress and wear their hairstyles in certain manners to retain their ethnic Ayu status. Separate from all these Ayus and the Cusco Ayu, there would be a guard of special troops for the emperor and they ran between 3,000 and 5,000. That's pretty typical for this time period, both in the Aztec and the Inca cases. Their implements of war, they did have missiles they would throw at first, usually in the form of slings, and then once hand-to-hand combat ensued as the armies grew closer, they had a variety of clubs they would use. The choppy clubs are more like studded maces or clubs that have an item on the end to do damage and destroy another human being that way, while the Makana club, it looks more like a sword. The way we would look at it might look like a sword today, and it also inflicted damage with sharp edges, so that's why we use a sword as kind of a comparison, though it's not made of steel, but it did have sharp edges to do its damage rather than blunt force like the choppy clubs. As far as defense, there were a variety of shields, helmets, discs around the body that were employed to try and minimize damage from the other warriors. And we'll see those in the following slides, what that looked like. Now going back to the Tampus, for those of you who might be in ROTC or involved in military history, the Tampus allow for a very quick army for the day. They could march without a 60-pound backpack, carrying one, and because they didn't have to carry their supplies, and because the supplies were waiting for them. This allowed the armies to move much more quickly, and this was the whole point of the supply system throughout the empire. When it came to the battles themselves, prior to the battles, the target of the Inca Empire would be addressed through diplomacy. It would receive, like the Aztec case, it would receive promises of leniency if they capitulated without going to battle. Some did, some didn't, and those who did not capitulate then had to fight. And those who lost those battles then, as far as we know, we don't have perfect information on it, but typically their mita requirements were higher as punishments, as well as some hostages that were taken. I'll talk about those in a second. Then the appropriate religious ceremonies took place in favor of the Incas usually, to Inti Sun and Koya Moon, and so on and so forth. So here we go. Here's Guamapoma de Ayala's drawings of these battles. The one on the right is, at least. The one on the left is an earlier post-conquest document showing the battles between two Andean groups. Notice on the right we have, this is supposed to be a, well, thank you Getty Images. This is supposed to be the 12th Inca, Huascar, and Huascar would be the Inca in Cusco when the Spanish arrived. Here we have, again, a little bit of an anachronism where one of his guards, they both are holding a Spanish implement of war. And so these are not Spaniards taking him in. So it looks like we have a little bit of that going on this drawing. Now I'm reading too much into it for you. But we see the Inca as the head of the battles. The Champi clubs in museums with the variety of implements that can be put on the end of the club in both cases. Now once the Ayus were conquered, then the Incas wanted to know immediately who was there, where did they live, what was the land like, what could they get out of the land. And so one technique of doing this, maybe you'll be a future leader of the United States or some other country, you can think about using this technique, is to absorb the Curacas that you just conquered into your system. You turn them into compliant leaders of their own people. You give them positions within their Ayu that they can maintain for their families. You do, though, force them to switch to Quechua so that there's no, insubordination going on that you don't know about. The Inca state would take hostages, generally two types. I'm going to amend them to three. And one is men, boys, that they would take to Cusco and turn them as much as they could into pro Cusco leaders. Then they would come back to the IU in future generations and rule that IU, and they would be somewhat Incaized. The second that's mentioned are Wakas, and Wakas, it's a little bit ambiguous, but they would, instead of coming back to be Caracas, they have a more religious element that they would be involved in. And yeah, so I think that's as far as we have to go for. It's kind of a religious hostage. It'd be in the religious system rather than the secular system. And I'm going to further divide that into the Akyas, and these are women that from the ruling families usually, unless they were considered very, very pretty and commoner, they would take those as well. And so these nobles, usually women, were brought into the Waka system, I guess you would call it, as opposed to future Karaka leaders, and they would be brought into the female portion of the religious ritual and ceremonial system. And some of them were killed in a religious ritual if there was a rebellion against the Inca Empire. We even have a case of many Akyas. So these are young girls. Usually they've been trained and gone through years of ritual experience in Cusco in the female religious system. And then, interestingly, they're brought back to the border of the Inca Empire and this conquered Ayu. And right on the border, which will usually be, a prominent topographical place, like a pass over a mountain or a mountain peak or something like that. Then they might be either executed there and buried, or we even have some that are buried alive. And then, from the Inca Empire's point of view, these sacrifices serve as a bridge that is a glue that is uniting the Inca Empire and this Ayu system. So we do have some archaeological discoveries of these Akyas, and even some that were killed. So very rarely, but sometimes, Ayus did revolt because they were more loyal to their Ayu than any sort of Cusco loyalty. But this was a dangerous game to play, and not many did, but some did. We tend to see it south of Cusco in Collasuyo more often, and this is a area in Collasuyo. And the reason this would typically start to rebel more is because it fulfills the two requirements for rebellion. One is distance from Cusco, and as the empire started to drift more and more to Quito in the later years, this area felt like it was far enough from the emperor to rebel and maybe get away with it. And the second, if the emperor is busy, likewise, this would help contribute to rebellion because you think you might be able to get away with it. And if the emperor was very far from Cusco and was very busy, then that was the time you usually see it. And this is what happened at this time. So that is the basic understanding of the political imperial system and how it operated up until the Spanish conquest. And the next keynote video will be on the cultural and religious worlds of this empire.